Good afternoon. My name is Julia McCullagh. I'm a tax partner at BDO, where I lead on the tax discussions with our natural resource clients. I'm joined by James Egert, a partner who leads on our tax strategy, risk and governance team at BDO, and we're delighted that we've got Dave Murray with us here today, who's head of tax policy and sustainability at Anglo American and chair of the CIOT International Tax Committee. Tax transparency is increasingly a matter of interest for corporate taxpayers and a wide range of their stakeholders, including the C-suite, their shareholders, their employees, tax authorities, and other governmental and non-governmental organisations. It's also becoming an integral part of the corporate environmental, social, and governance agenda. The natural resource industry, for a number of reasons, is highly focused in this area, and the recently published Anglo American Annual Tax and Economic Contribution Report, the 8th in fact, is a great example of this. So we wanted to put our heads together and spend the next 10 or 15 minutes exploring this area and the themes of tax transparency and what it means in the natural resource industry. So let's start with a broad opening question. James, why is tax transparency such a hot topic at the moment? And what are you seeing our clients focusing on in this area?
Good question, thanks Julia. And well, I probably will sort of broaden it out and just remind everyone that the focus on responsible tax and tax transparency isn't exactly new. And it's been around for quite a long time, and we might remember going back to the banking crisis around 10 years ago, that tax was very much on the front pages of a lot of newspapers. But I would say that in recent times, tax transparency, and when I say recent, I mean sort of months or in the last year, it's been much more on the radar of senior management. Probably because ESG is very much on the forefront of boards' minds. And as we'll no doubt speak about later, how does tax fit into that? I will say that historically, responsible tax has always been a sort of concern or of an interest to boards, mainly because they're interested in what the risk appetite is from a tax planning perspective, or simply what the economic contribution is for many businesses. Now, for those of you in the UK, you're probably very familiar with the tax strategy requirement that was brought in back in 2016, which requires probably around 2,000 businesses in the UK to publish their tax principles. So that's just like a page or two. But there's also been a cascade of tax transparency initiatives, from things like the sort of automatic exchange of information to country by country reporting, and especially in your area, which is natural resources, what we've seen is historically the EITI. We've seen a lot of the EU reforms, the EU legislation focused on natural resources. So I'm not going to steal your thunder too much on that one. And what I personally quite liked, which I know we discussed previously, was the GRI 207. And that is something that's recently come in. I think it's quite well. Drafted in a way, in terms of getting organisations to sort of opt in terms of how they want to publish their responsible tax and tax behaviours, including some of the sort of quantitative figures as well. So that's what I would say is sort of the drivers and the journey that businesses are on.
Well, that's a really helpful introduction, James. Thank you. So, Dave, now if we think about this from your perspective, from the Anglo American perspective, and indeed the broader natural resource perspective, what sort of questions are you seeing in this area, and who is asking them?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. So, I mean, we see transparency in some ways in the same way, and I think James makes a lot of good points. There's a lot of increasingly legal requirements, particularly industry focused. You've got the EU Accounting Directive, Chapter 10, that focus on extractive and logging activities. You've got similar rules in Canada. You've got the Australian Transparency Code. You've got all of these things that we find ourselves having to comply with. And in our industry, I think ahead of many other industries, because we have always been an industry that's under a greater focus because of our role in society and in the countries we operate in. So we've really, not through choice, I don't think, as an industry, but we have had to respond to these questions before many other industries have had to, because there's been legislation there to do so. And then you've got things like GRI 207, which, while it's not a legal requirement that we comply with GRI 207, as an organisation, Anglo American wants to be GRI compliant. So it's not something we really have a choice in. We will be compliant with GRI 207, and we have been now for 2 years. But I think it's much more than just a compliance obligation. It's much more than just publishing numbers in set formats that other people have dictated. It's really, for those businesses that want to take it up, it's an opportunity. It's an opportunity to engage with your stakeholders, to tell your story, to put the narrative around those numbers, and actually make it meaningful for your stakeholders. And in the context of this much broader discussion that's going on about the role of business in society, ESG, sustainability, tax is not the only metric, but it certainly is a very tangible metric that you can point to and that people are asking questions about and people do want to see more about. And so I think it's a really good place for that conversation to start.
So you mentioned a really interesting point there, that this is very much part of the ESG agenda. James, could you give us a bit more around that and how you're seeing tax transparency within that?
Yes, and I thought we might come back to ESG at some point because it is very much on boards' agendas, and I'm sure in your business we talked about this. It's very much present for our own businesses too. So ESG, environmental, social, and governance. And I always start with sort of where is the T in ESG, which is T for tax, by the way, in case you're wondering. And so if we think about it from an environmental perspective, there's green subsidies and things like that, and how does tax fit into that in terms of tax incentives? And for the S for social, where we've got the ethical investment and various philanthropy and other ways like that, and tax will always fit in there. But I'm hoping, David, you would agree that probably what we're looking at today, although the other two are important and there's a lot of work going in, tax teams are very focused on those. From a tax transparency and a responsible tax perspective, the governance is important. So governance for me is all about risk management and transparency in the business and making sure you're doing the right thing and being a responsible taxpayer. And I really like what you said earlier because, tax is a key part of that. Tax will be a key part of the whole ESG, especially the G agenda. And so whether it's your business with the report or wider businesses, if there are ESG reports, if there are sort of historically, as it used to be, CSR or similar, tax should really sort of fit in there or align, or tax should align to what you're doing from an ESG agenda point. So it's a really good question.
Well, I think that leads us on very nicely. So, David, you recently published the Anglo American Tax and Economic Contribution Report. Perhaps you could tell us something about that report, some of its key messages, and perhaps some of the key challenges in pulling it together.
Yeah, thanks, Joe. And actually, it does segue nicely from what James was saying at the end there. So in the past, and we've been doing this for 8 years now, but for many of those years, there were a very small range of stakeholders relative to the stakeholders who are interested today that were interested in that report, and they were interested in the cash tax we paid in the jurisdictions in which we operated in a rather narrow sense. I think as this ESG discussion has developed, what has happened is ratings agencies, investors, broader society are all much more interested in tax as an ESG metric. Tax being something that's just as important to be explained as part of how the business operates and its place in the world. So one of the things we did last year, a really critical thing we did last year, was we looked at how we could better align our tax and economic contribution report with our broader reporting suite. So historically, the broader reporting suite, the annual report, the sustainability report, have had very different stakeholders, and they've come out earlier in the year, and then we focused on the tax and economic contribution report. And that's meant, because they're serving different needs, that they've got different bases of preparation, different, what some might use cash, others would use accrued data. Some would, some entities and joint ventures might be included, others might not be. But what we wanted to do this year was really accelerate the tax and economic contribution report and bring it into that broader reporting suite, publish it much sooner, publish it on an aligned basis, so that people could look at the reports as a whole and really understand tax as part of that broader discussion. And that was not without its challenges, it has to be said. We were looking at some new processes, and we were looking at accelerating them at the same time. We've got a fantastic tax reporting team and a fantastic finance team and sustainability reporting team as well. So we had to do a lot of planning to get that up and running and operational, but we did deliver it on time, and I think it's a report we can be proud of. On top of the numbers, though, something that many stakeholders are asking for is a lot more about context, and I think that drives a lot of the messaging behind the report is that context. So it wasn't just about the numbers, it was about the narrative. And it wasn't just about publishing our tax strategy saying, these are our standards of tax governance. what we were hearing from some stakeholders was they didn't really understand what we meant by tax governance. They didn't really understand, people who work in tax understand what good tax governance is, but people outside of tax probably don't understand it. So that's one area, and the tax and the sustainable mining plan was another area in the report where we put some case studies in. We've really tried to bring it to life. We've talked about our tax control framework and our tax risk management policy and how we actually operationalise that in everyday language. And we hope that really brings it to life to a broader range of stakeholders, actually what the governance piece of ESG means from a tax perspective.
Thanks, Dave. That was a really helpful insight. So, James, is that consistent with what we're seeing other clients doing?
Well, I think it should be consistent, and I'm saying that without flattering Dave and the report too much. And it's definitely what I would see as sort of good or leading practice in terms of what tax transparency and responsible tax is being, how it's being articulated anyway by a lot of businesses. And I'm saying that because I'm going to pick up on one or two things that you said. First of all, you talked about context and you talked about case studies, and I think that's brilliant because who's reading this document? Well, obviously your internal stakeholders, external stakeholders, but it's available to everyone. And so if we talk about what's typically in a tax strategy, which is, we've got a low risk appetite or we've got a good governance framework in place, what does that really mean? And to bring it to life with real examples about how you manage risk, what that means, maybe practical examples about what's going on in one particular jurisdiction or another. And also you did talk about the tax control framework. Now, for those who are not familiar, I'm sure we all are, tax control framework, it's got an OECD definition. It's all about how controls and processes in relation to tax operations across the business. So it's wider than risk and it's wider than responsible tax, but it really is there in terms of demonstrating good behaviours. So my view, what was your question? It was about what other businesses are doing. I think there's a journey. There's a lot of businesses just publishing their tax strategy. I don't think there's anything wrong in that. I think there are various triggers and reasons why businesses, and in natural resources especially, because of the historic focus on government payments and such like, there is a sort of slightly ahead of the game. But I think all industries now, especially those with a strong brand or strong ESG ethic, are probably looking to demonstrate good behaviours when it comes to tax, and documents like that. And the other thing I'm going to point out is I'm very much aware of the hard work that goes into it in terms of the narrative and also collecting the data. Getting that total tax contribution or global tax footprint data isn't easy, and getting accurate, but it really demonstrates what the economic contribution is. So one or two things I just wanted to say first of all, and we did pick up on this earlier in another conversation, but it's also an amazing opportunity for finance and tax to really demonstrate what they're doing within the business and externally in terms of good tax behaviours, in terms of developing that tax control framework, and in terms of having expected standards of conduct and how they want tax to be operated in their business. So I think what we're seeing is that movement away from just principles to a bit more. And I'm not going to mention any names, but we work with a lot of businesses that are looking to do a tax report. So what is their approach to tax? What does it mean to sort of promote tax within their business? And to, most of all, I'm going to finish here, align to the wider ESG agenda, and how does tax fit into that? And so I think it's a good journey. I think obviously you're ahead of the game, but I think a lot of businesses are doing something similar at the moment.
And that's really consistent with what I see, James, actually as well. I mean, often I think there's been the regulatory requirements, but then also there's been a report that paints the full picture when groups go slightly further to really explain that to their stakeholders. And certainly from an NR perspective, while that's often been the preserve of the very largest groups in the past, we're now seeing increasing numbers of questions from actually sort of the full spectrum of our NR clients wanting to look at this and see what it is and how they should be communicating with their stakeholders in this area. So let's finish then with one final question, which is around, what sort of broader reputational pressures should board members be thinking about as they look at this area?
I'll go first, but I'll be brief because I've talked a lot. I'll be brief. So your question was, what are the broader reputational issues in relation to tax? So we talked a lot about tax transparency and publishing data. Where's a good place to start? I think really trying to define, making sure that you have a consistent understanding within the business about what the tax risk appetite is. What is your attitude towards tax planning? What is your approach to risk management? Now, all of these things are in the UK's definition of a tax strategy, but making sure that's fully understood and embedded in the business. So really, from my perspective, it is, when I talk to businesses, what is your risk appetite? And it could be anything. You know, different businesses will have different risk appetites, and there's no one right answer, being careful. But I think having that clearly defined, having embedded in the business and building on that in terms of what you mean. But of course, there's two other things, first of all. First of all, it's those curveballs. So, you know, the Pandora Papers comes out and other things. And if I was a head of tax, I would want to make sure I'm not going to end up on the front pages of the paper or being hauled up into the board to say, why are you in, you know, the next round or whatever it is. And so where I would finish is have that culture of no surprises in the business. Know where your tax risks are, know what your risk appetite is, and know where there could be that particular risk. And that's probably what I would say in terms of the broader reputational issues in terms of tax.
And Dave, how would you respond to that?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with everything James has said. I think there's a point here around trying to say too much, trying to do too much. This is definitely a journey, and James was talking about this being a journey earlier, but you don't want to take that first step before you know where you're going. I think you can get caught out if you try and say too much before you're ready to say too much. So I would say be strategic about it and really think about where you want to get to, what your stakeholders actually want. And the stakeholders in the mining industry are going to be very different to the stakeholders in other industries. You know, you probably see a lot of similarities across the whole of the natural resources piece, but other industries will have different stakeholders and different perspectives. So what they want will be quite different, and really think about what they want to see and develop the strategy for getting there. But it's not a one step and you're there. It is a journey, and it's really important that that stakeholders can see that you're walking the journey. It's not a reactionary thing where you're saying something that's not part of the broader strategy, because you will only come unstuck if you're saying one thing one year and then you're saying a different thing another year, or it doesn't quite tie up with the broader sustainability piece that the organisation's working on. It really needs some work and some thought up front, which I think we're in a really good place as an industry to do, actually, because of the pressure that I mentioned at the beginning that the industry's been under for a long time from different stakeholders to demonstrate our value to society and the communities that we operate in. I think we're in a really good place to have that conversation, but just make sure that you know where it's going.
Thank you very much. Thank you both. I think that's been an absolutely fascinating insight. I think we're all agreed here we're on a journey, but I think what's really happened recently is that the journey seems to have gathered pace as the ES agenda has become higher profile. So I think we've got more developments to come. Thank you both.